Anastasia. It is for good reason that they say that knowledge is power. In this regard, I would like to come back to the conversation about the primordial spiritual practices. In particular, I would be very grateful to you if you told the readers about the pyramid meditation, which is classified among the fundamental spiritual practices. I hope this meditation will help people, just like it helped us in our time, to comprehend reality, get a personal spiritual experience in knowing your own soul, and thanks to the deepest feelings, reach an understanding of what true freedom really is. Rigden, certainly. Anastasia. But before you proceed with the technique of doing this unique meditation, I would like to clarify with you some significant moments for the readers. First of all, the ones related to understanding what an altered state of consciousness during meditation is. You know, I came across such instances when people, even after reading the books, did meditations, to put it mildly, simply with imagination. Upon a detailed discussion, it turned out that they just did not understand what a meditation really was, what an altered state of consciousness in practice was, although they had read a lot about it. In some cases, people thinking that they were meditating, in fact, remained practically in the awake state, which is typical for them during the day, without bothering to switch to a different state of consciousness. That is why they often had thoughts about everyday matters, about their current work, everyday life, experiences during the day, and so on. That is, they had various distracting thoughts during the simulated exercise. Naturally, such a meditation, as a theory, happened only in their imagination. In other cases, people simply fell asleep instead of meditating. Generally, it happened after they were exhausted during the workday and then sat down to meditate. Sleep, as it is known, is also one of the altered states of consciousness. So they mistook it for meditation, and that is why, while making such an effort of will, in the sense of forcing themselves to meditate despite being tired after a workday, they, in fact, did not see any results. Rigden. These people need to understand what altered states of consciousness are, what kind they can be, and what the difference between them is. These altered states of consciousness, for instance, that very sleep or meditation, are characterized by complete relaxation of the body, mental calmness, and drowsiness. But this is only an indicator of the beginning of an altered state of consciousness. The division comes later. Some people get immersed in meditation, a conscious control of the subtle processes of the invisible world, while others fall asleep, the unconscious state. Anastasia. I've been saying just that. In other words, people lack real practical understanding of what a true meditation is and how it really takes place. Rigden. I would advise these people, first of all, to understand what an elementary autogenic training is, learn to relax the body, control their thoughts, practice keeping their attention focused on one thing for long periods of time, and then to proceed to practicing meditation, that is, to a deeper immersion into an altered state of consciousness, to learn the basic meditation techniques that you described in the first book Sensei and in the other books in the series, and only then to begin to master the fundamental spiritual practices. Anastasia. I agree with you. People are different. And while some grasp the essence quickly, others need time to figure everything out in more detail. But more often, people simply lack basic knowledge about themselves and the general mechanisms of the brain's function in different states of consciousness. I know that you possess unique knowledge in the field of neurophysiology and functioning of the human brain. Could you elaborate on the topic of altered states of consciousness, or at least orient the readers in publicly accessible information, or share knowledge that can be made public? Rigdon. Well, perhaps solely within the limits of the modern scientific understanding of the functioning of the brain, so that it might be clearer to people what is meant and in which direction one should conduct one's research. As it is known, the functioning of the brain is associated with electromagnetic waves. The brain can operate in different modes, each of which is characterized by a certain psychic and physiological state of consciousness. The human being, as a personality, thanks to concentrating his attention, can control several such states of consciousness. In everyday life, he is most often in one of the states, which in the scientific circles is called the awake state. Scientists, while measuring the brain's electrical activity over time, conditionally indicate the state of active wakefulness as beta rhythm. Its frequency range is from 14 to 35 Hz, and the voltage is 10 to 30 MkV. Beta waves are regarded as fast waves, and they're low amplitude vibrations of the overall total potential of the brain. On the EEG, the waveform resembles, relatively speaking, triangles with pointed tops. Beta rhythm is generally recorded during the functioning of the brain's frontal central regions. However, when a person pays attention to something new, unexpected, to any information that he hears, intensive mental activity, or a powerful emotional excitation, this rhythm grows and can spread to other parts of the brain. Beta rhythm is typical of the brain's functioning when a person works mentally, is emotionally stressed, and under the influence of various irritants. All in all, it should be noted that such a notion as fatigue is not typical for the brain. You must simply understand how it works, switch from one activity to another in time, and be able to change the quality of the states of consciousness at the right time. Everyday life constantly involves a person's psychological self-tuning, upon which, incidentally, also depends the overall condition of the body. Throughout the day, a person is influenced by different external factors, such as, for example, sound and light, not to mention the effects of the invisible world. All of them are everyday irritants which, one way or another, affect physiological and other biological processes of human life. Excessive anxiety, anger, irritability, and psychological fatigue are accompanied by tension of the muscles of the face, neck, arms, and so on. In its turn, a tense muscle also becomes a generator of excitation impulses. The task of the person performing an autogenic training or tuning up for a meditation is to limit the flow of excitatory signals. That is why he sits down in a comfortable position in silence, eliminates any sound stimuli, closes his eyes, eliminates the impact of the sources of visual stimuli, switches his attention from various everyday thoughts, experiences, and worries to inner peace and silence. That is, when possible, he eliminates the direct influence of the invisible world. Next, he focuses on relaxing his muscles, eliminates another channel of excitation, and then reaches the state of complete relaxation altogether. Thus, a person readjusts the working mode of his psyche and consequently of the nervous system. Thanks to such self-tuning, he can control himself through clear mental self-orders, auto-reports. Anastasia. Thought discipline opens great opportunities for a human being. In the state of meditation, he can control those mechanisms of his complex energy structure that are not accessible in other states, including the awake state. Naturally, when performing a meditative technique correctly, he observes a spiritual surge, insight, development of intuitive knowledge, as well as side effects of such work, a burst of energy, good mood, and increase in creativity, which in turn has a positive effect on the person's general state. Rigdon. Absolutely. All these mechanisms must be understood. Attention in a meditation is like electric current in the network. What you connect to it is what will work. Therefore, it is important to keep the focus on the main processes taking place during the meditation. Generally, the person doing a spiritual practice can be compared to a military pilot performing a combat mission in a supersonic fighter. Initially, the pilot practices to perfection all the actions on the aviation, aerobatic flight trainer on the ground, simulating a plane flight. This can be compared to a person who has just started to learn the primary stages of meditation, namely the process of relaxation, disconnection from extraneous thoughts, immersion in a state of meditation, primary sensations at the level of the physical body, such as heat in the solar plexus, or a slight tingling in the area of chakrans, or energy movement along the arms, and so on. This stage can be conditionally called the primary one, from only theoretical ideas about meditation to acquiring the first practical skills. The second stage in learning meditative practices is similar, figuratively speaking, to a pilot getting practical experience actually in the air when he gets into a fighting machine and trains in flight. Here, he comes to understand that flying an airplane in the sky is not quite the same as performing the same exercises on a simulator and imitator on the ground. The significant difference is not in the technique, but in the sensations and the understanding of the flight process and life in a completely different space, the sky. Like the pilot, the meditator understands the substantial difference between theoretical and practical knowledge when he works on himself daily and controls his animal nature. The person begins to change. This is the important thing, because meditation is only a tool. In other words, he begins to control his thoughts in everyday life, to keep them pure, track his psychological reactions, and avoid negativity in his consciousness. When the person does not control his thoughts, he blames everyone for his troubles and wrongs. He condemns all, is unhappy with many things, preaches to everyone without practicing what he preaches, and so on. But when the person begins to work on himself, he turns his attention not to the external, but to his internal causes as to why he perceives and reacts to the surrounding world in this way, and not differently. The person begins to understand why he succumbs to these external provocations and how he should divert his attention from his multiple egocentric desires, instances of resentment and aggression of the animal nature, how to switch it to the front essence and the deepest feelings emanating from the soul, and abide on the spiritual wave. So when the person does such work on himself on a daily basis, without giving any concessions to his animal nature, then a completely new level of perception opens for him in meditations. He begins to understand what meditation is and to go deeply into this process unusual for him. The person learns to stay in a completely different state of consciousness, which is different from the awake state and sleep. That is, to sense in practice this difference between the states of consciousness, to understand the world through the deepest feelings and intuitive knowledge, which is not a product of logic. And finally, the third stage is when the military pilot performs a combat mission in flight on a supersonic fighter. He no longer thinks about the mechanisms of operation of the plane. He simply automatically starts them. He does not think about that unusual space in which he is. He already lives in this space. The pilot feels every movement of the aircraft, and his attention is focused on the main thing, to carry out the combat mission. So it is with the person who is deeply engaged in spiritual practices. At this stage, he makes the habit of controlling his animal nature, automatically starts the meditation mechanisms with clear mental orders, and performs the meditation itself solely with his deepest feelings, without any thoughts. The mechanism of spiritual practices, assuming that an individual does serious work on himself in everyday life, brings the person to a completely different level of perception, including the fourth, the fifth, or the sixth dimension, from the perspective of the observer from the spiritual nature. He begins to explore the familiar world of matter and the world of subtle energies only with his deepest feelings, not with logic and material thoughts. After all, thoughts are a product of matter, nothing more than that. However, the spiritual deepest feelings are a completely different quality of perception and a totally different comprehension of the all-encompassing knowledge. It is that which people call enlightenment. Anastasia. On that side, one gains an amazing clarity and precision of understanding the processes which take place there. However, after a meditation, when you try to explain to others what you experienced, you realize that it is impossible to accurately communicate what you felt on that side through familiar images and associations. Thanks to this, you realize that there is a significant difference in your daily life between the real processes and the mind's game, those associations with which logic operates from the perspective of the material perception of the world. Yes, when you start experiencing it all in practice and get in touch with the true reality, then you maturely realize why each day that you spend in the spiritual work is so important, and for what thoughts and deeds you squander the power of your attention each day. After all, everything has inevitable consequences first and foremost for your soul and your personality. Rigdon. Undoubtedly, that is so. The animal nature lulls the personality into different illusions, wrapping its consciousness with a thick, misty veil of the material existence. This fog can only be dispelled by the personal spiritual growth of the human being when he, thanks to the experience gained, begins to understand what the true reality is. Figuratively, the process of man's spiritual growth, his self-control and self-perfection, can be compared to creating conditions for the growth of a tree seed planted into the ground. The seed, as a part of a fruit that once matured in the atmospheric environment, the sky, is conditionally the soul. The earth is external earthly conditions for the soul, that is, our thoughts and actions in the material world. What conditions we create for ourselves, whether we have a drought, freeze it, let too much moisture into the soil, or create normal conditions for the seed to grow, let us put it this way, for our spiritual development, so the result will be. After all, if you do not look after the seed, it can die, and there will be no tree or fruits from it. While if you take care of the seed, it has a chance to sprout out of the ground, force its way into the open air, where it will experience the influence of another environment, which is completely different from the ground. But at the same time, it will still retain its roots in the ground, continuing to feel its effects, even though not as much as before, but in its new quality. In other words, during the person's life in three-dimensional space, the personality has the ability to develop spiritually and achieve fusion with the soul, therefore to escape into eternity. Of course, the seed, ground, tree, sky, perception, development, these are all words of human associations, because as you have rightly noted, in practice, when the person really starts getting to know and perceive the other world, he understands much more than can be expressed in words. So meditation is a tool with which the system of, figuratively speaking, the spiritual navigation of the complex human structure turns on. This helps to coordinate the direction of movement towards the ultimate goal, spiritual liberation, avoid various detours along the route, and achieve a better quality of motion. And since a human being is a living energy structure, it evolves as a result of use of such precise instruments, thanks to the spiritual development of the controlling operator itself, the personality. Anastasia. Yes, in contemporary science, there is still a lack of understanding of the importance of processes which occur in meditative state. Rigdon. Well, scientists are still considering meditation itself as a state of calm wakefulness. In the human brain, they observe a special frequency rhythm, alpha rhythm, which is apparent primarily in the back part of the head. The area near epiphysis, the pineal gland, using the technology available to them today. Conditionally, it is assumed that alpha rhythm corresponds to the rhythmic oscillations of the potential with the frequency of 8 Hz to 13 Hz, the average amplitude of 30 to 70 mkV, although in reality this range spans from 7 Hz to 13 Hz in meditation. We must also understand that when a person has thoughts and pays attention to them, this rhythm reduces the amplitude of oscillation, that is, it weakens or disappears and is replaced by a different rhythm. Anastasia. From 7 to 13. These numbers are quite interesting, especially if you make certain comparisons. Interestingly, 7 and 13 are significant numbers in mythology of many peoples. In the symbolism of the secret knowledge, number 7 points at the 7th dimension, which is spiritually important for humans. In mythology, it was associated with the description of the idea of the universe. It was used as the main numerical value for describing the world tree, the complete number of divine pantheons, and the universal characteristic of almost all that is counted in the mythological space among different peoples of the world. Interestingly, while doing certain spiritual practices, sometimes the meditator will observe the processes and phenomena which are reflected as associations in the basis of certain myths. Apparently, in the ancient times, in order to somehow convey their spiritual experiences to future generations, people would capture the most important moments through associative images in myths, legends, and parables. Rigdon. You have absolutely correctly pointed out that in certain meditations, let us put it this way, an unusual structure of this world opens up to people. How can it be explained to those who do not know about the existence of processes in the invisible world? Only through the associations which listeners can understand. Ultimately, the world's mythology is an attempt by people to record the knowledge of the visible and the invisible worlds, information about the past, and the spiritual experience of mankind in associative forms which are clear to future generations. Anastasia. And number 13? Besides the fact that it stands for a full circle of power, 12 plus 1, it also serves as a special number, for example, in space geometry. You once mentioned the direct connection of geometry with physics in the course of a conversation about the spatial geometry of the universe. Back then, you mentioned the knowledge of geometry that was once given to people a long time ago, including the knowledge about semi-regular polyhedra in three-dimensional space. Among these are the so-called nowadays 13 Archimedean bodies. You know, surprisingly, we studied this topic a long time ago while still at school. I vividly remember this definition. Semi-regular polyhedra are the polyhedra, all the facets of which are regular polygons, while the polyhedral angles at the vertices are symmetric. But only many years later did I start looking at this knowledge after your story from a completely different angle with an interest of a researcher. I still can't help thinking about in what a complex sequence, harmonious in the sacred meaning, you then placed the 13 Archimedean bodies. After all the basic symbols and signs are observed in this order, as well as the outline of the general figure in the form of the diagonal cross consisting of the bodies themselves. Moreover, the four essences and the center are marked. there is an evolution from simple forms to more complex ones. People, on the other hand, place these semi-regular polyhedra in a slightly different manner, referring to the fact that they were mentioned in the works of ancient Greek scholar Archimedes. But today it is no secret that the discovery of this knowledge is only attributed to his name. As a rule, there is a link typical for such cases, saying that the evidence of the given ancient scholar on this issue is lost. I became interested. How did he find out about these 13 figures? Archimedes came from a noble family and independently studied different sciences, including geometry. In the largest cultural center of that time, the Egyptian city of Alexandria, which was then under the dominion of the Greeks, as is known, the famous library of Alexandria, Museion at Alexandria, had already been founded by that time. It was a higher educational institution of international importance, and unique ancient books, scrolls from different countries were kept there. It is known that Archimedes worked there afterwards. I did some research in historical sources where such knowledge about polyhedra and spatial figures was mentioned in those days and earlier. As you recommended, I looked into the written records of the Hittites, the Indo-European people who lived in the central part of Asia Minor in the 2nd millennium BC. The Hittites received the mathematical knowledge from the Babylonians. That is, roughly speaking, 15 centuries before ancient Greek mathematicians, Pythagoras, Euclid, and Archimedes. People had already known of such concepts as, for example, raising a number to a power, tables of square and cube roots, formula for calculating the area of the triangle, trapezium, circle, volume of the cube, parallelepiped, cone, an ordinary and truncated pyramid, as well as other dimensional figures. Indeed, people possessed all this knowledge since ancient times. Judging by monumental building, it was also used by the ancient Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Indians, inhabitants of Mesoamerica, and other ancient peoples. I also read again the information about the star polyhedra, in particular the Kepler-Poinsot polyhedra, about the stellated octahedron, which was rediscovered for the modern mankind by the famous scientist Leonardo da Vinci. It is believed that the forms were suggested to people by nature itself. But you're right, what kind of forms are they? These are really symbols and signs. Take the example of the triangle, pyramid, cube, star, and so on. Now I understand better not only the principle of influence through working signs, but also why and how particular symbols were used for a more accurate transfer of a certain meditative technique. Now people have an opportunity to expand their knowledge both in the field of macro and microcosm, explore nature at the level of the structure of molecules, atoms, and more subtle organization of microcosm. Surprisingly, everything is physics. All is wave establishing a specific form of existence. Take crystals of ice or rock crystal, quartz. They often resemble a sharpened pencil that is the form of a hexagonal prism with the apex in the form of a hexagonal pyramid. Everything in the material world has a certain spatial position. Once I became interested in the information about experiments on the effect of sound waves on small particles, in particular on dry sand placed upon the surface of a vibrating plate. Amazingly, the sand starts to line up into different geometrically regular shaped patterns under vibration, and their form directly depends on the sound frequency. I will clarify for those readers who do not know that such patterns are called Chladni figures, named after their discoverer, German scientist who worked in the field of experimental acoustics in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. Today, The results of his research are used to study the natural frequencies of phone diaphragms, loudspeakers, and microphones. Rigdon. Sound and geometrically regular shaped signs are the realm of pure physics, and therefore the first indicator of comprehending the mystery of the global sound and the working signs by mankind. In fact, these are scientifically based discoveries of what has been known to people since ancient times and has been recorded in the legends of different peoples. Anastasia. Yes, this reminds me of that unique information about the primordial sound which you mentioned as you were telling us about the Grail, a kind of a pass into spiritual world, the world of God. I recorded it in the book Sensei 4. You said that the formula of the primordial sound consists of certain working signs. Their activation leads to the manifestation of a superpower, a combination of the primordial lotus and Allat. When one thinks about it from the perspective of the already known knowledge, for instance in physics, the geometry of space, global time, and the structured information, fundamental information building blocks, one better understands the depth of the knowledge which you have given to the world. Rigdon. The one who fearlessly penetrates the depth sooner or later knows the truth. While being on the surface, one can only observe a distorted reflection of what is hidden in the depth. Anastasia. Yes, in order to know the truth, it is necessary to penetrate its depth, which is possible only from the perspective of the observer from the spiritual nature. As sages had said, in order to know the truth, one must forget about oneself. I also wanted to say a few words about fractals in nature, from the Latin word fractus, meaning fractured. These geometric figures that are self-similar inside, which you mentioned in one of the conversations. Fractals really represent an entirely wonderful world of unexpected spatial structures and forms, beauty and harmony. I expanded my knowledge also on these topics. It turns out there are so many things I don't know about the world yet, and how fascinating and useful the very process of cognition is. A fractal is a geometric shape in which one and the same motif is repeated on a consecutively decreasing scale. Indeed, a pattern that has one and the same structure is repeated quite frequently in nature. One can see this by enlarging or reducing the object of study by any number of times. Self-similarity as a property of fractals can be found in many objects, systems, and natural structures. For example, in snowflakes, clouds, flame, turbulent flow of water, tree crowns, DNA, human blood circulatory system, and so on. Fractals are found in many natural phenomena and processes. This is like another level of complexity of geometry of space, but as I understand, this is far from the most complex one, taking into consideration what you once told us. As you advised, I inquired also about modern scientific achievements in the field of fractal geometry. It turns out that the fractal model is being very widely used in many areas of different sciences. For example, in chemical kinetics, from the Greek word kinetikos, meaning the moving one. Taking into consideration that this area of physical chemistry is connected to biology and other areas of natural science, I can imagine what an enormous amount of study material it is, including in the field of medicine. Fractal models are also used to create antenna structures and in computer science to improve traffic as well as to compress and store data in a highly compact form. Scientists consider them to be an alternative future of the modern Internet. Additionally, fractal models are used in nuclear physics and astronomy to study elementary particles, processes on the sun, and the distribution of galaxies in the universe. Indeed, fractal properties are found also in the spiral energy movement to which you drew our attention back then. I found it in indirect evidence when physicists observed the behavior of fractal clusters in external electric and magnetic fields with the formation of a spiral as well as turbulent flows. Large vortices would give rise to smaller vortices there, while those to still smaller ones, and such a division of spiral energies was observed up to those visible limits which were technically available to scientists. Rigdon. When man searches, he actually finds more than he expected to find. The knowledge about fractals is more ancient than modern people imagine. It is just that in the human society, the usual process of borrowing, concealing, and renaming the knowledge occurs. The usual vanity games take place from generation to generation, from century to century. Anastasia. Yes, I've read about algebraic Newton fractals. Rigdon. Well, this is not the most interesting thing in history. Remember the Sierpinski triangle, the fractal proposed by the Polish mathematician in early 20th century. Anastasia. Is this the triangle in which one can observe the process of repetition of self-similar triangles in a closed system on a plane? Rigdon. That is absolutely right. The so-called recursion, from the Latin word recursio, meaning a return. Anastasia. Yes, I've read about it. I remember getting interested in your words about the Koch snowflake as you were explaining this mathematical process from the perspective of advanced physics. I then started searching for information about the snowflake, and I simultaneously discovered other information, including about this self-similar triangle. It became a really interesting discovery for me when I'd compared all these natural geometric shapes of the material world with the primordial knowledge about the working signs, processes related to human spiritual development, and also with the signs and symbols that I discovered when I was exploring mankind's archaeological past, including those which were painted by representatives of different cultures in ancient times onto rocks, ceramic dishes intended for magic and ritual ceremonies or sacred rites, and so on. Rigdon. There is nothing difficult here. If we take symbols and signs of, for example, the Cukotny, Trypillian, or ancient Egyptian civilizations, and match them with information about parallel worlds, tunneling, and the astral mirrors meditation. Anastasia. About tunneling and the astral mirrors meditation? Of course, recursion in physics. What is an astral tunnel? This is a classic example of endless recursion, only in another dimension. Two mirrors facing each other create two corridors out of fading reflections of mirrors. In physics, this is a known example of infinite repetition of the fractal. And considering that in many cases, ornaments of ancient people actually repeat the geometry of spaces, it turns out that ancient people knew more about all these processes than we do, and in practice and not in theory at that. Rigdon. It is just that in the modern world, the majority of people have forgotten the main purpose for which they actually need this knowledge. So unfortunately, they direct everything into the material channel of understanding of the world. Why is it that even scientists, while working with the materials, processes, and phenomena which constitute a part of the single whole, are still asking themselves the question, what is the meaning of my life? After all, scientific work may eventually help a scientist to understand spiritual aspects, if, of course, the person will concern himself with the main work of his life, spiritual self-development. Many people who lived in ancient times, even without possessing such detailed information about the material world that the modern learned man has, but armed with spiritual knowledge, understood the most important thing, what this earthly world is and how to conduct oneself in order to go beyond its boundaries to reach the spiritual world. Mirror reflections and deepenings towards both the macrocosm and the microcosm of the material world lead to interpenetration, which begets in a person, as an observer inside the system, a sensation of infinite similarity of a part to the whole. But these sensations are illusory, for matter is temporary and limited in its manifestation. The real eternity for a human is concealed only inside his soul, in this infinitely small something, which has a gateway to infinitely large something, which forms areas of mutual attraction and interpenetration at its intersections. This is the true infinite similarity of a part to the whole. Anastasia. Yes, there is the gist of truth in your words. An inner feeling has come over me just now, a kind of a deep understanding that it is in this that the main laws of creation are contained. It's an interesting state. I clearly understand it, but this realization comes as if from the soul. The feeling is that it's impossible to grasp all its immensity with logic.